All right, welcome back. We're on slide 20. This is lesson 4, Asia-Pacific War, part 2. So next on the list for Japan was the island of Corregidor in Manila Bay. And on May the 6th, U.S. General Jonathan Wainwright, he was MacArthur's second in command, opened surrender negotiations with the Japanese. And most of the remaining American troops were taken captive along with General Wainwright. Next slide. Finally, the Japanese were masters of the Pacific. However, the combination of Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, and the occupation of the Philippines enraged American citizens, and they demanded something be done. And so the U.S. Chief of Staff agreed to bomb Tokyo on the morning of April the 18th, 1942, while General Wainwright's forces tried to hold Corregidor. And while this was going on, 16 B-25 bombers flew off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. And this is the famous Doolittle's Raid. And they did little damage to Tokyo, but what did happen was that showed the Japanese military as well as the Japanese civilians that they were not untouchable. Next slide. Following the conquest of the Philippines, the Japanese next turned their attention to New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And by taking these two island chains, Japan hoped to eliminate the last Allied base between Japan and Australia, as well as providing a security perimeter around Japan's recent conquests in the Dutch East Indies. It was also hoped that the operation would draw out the U.S. Navy's carriers that the Japanese were unable to destroy at Pearl Harbor, and then they could now destroy them. To accomplish these missions, the Japanese Carrier Task Force, consisting of 3 aircraft carriers, arrived at Tulagi, one of the small islands in the Solomon Island chain, on May the 3rd, 1942. Japanese forces quickly occupied the island. They set up a seaplane base there. Alerted to Japanese intentions by radio intercepts, U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, dispatched the carriers USS Yorktown and the USS Lexington to an area of water known as the Coral Sea to protect Port Moresby. On May the 4th, U.S. aircraft from the Yorktown and the Lexington ambushed the Japanese Carrier Task Force, which consisted of the Shokaru, the Zuikaku, and the Shoho, 3 Japanese carriers. And the resulting battle of the Coral Sea, as it came to be known, goes down in history as the first naval battle where the opposing surface ships never saw each other. It was also the debut of the aircraft carrier as the queen of naval warfare. Both sides used carrier-based aircraft to sort of pummel each other until the Japanese finally pulled away and retreated. On May the 4th, 1942, planes from the USS Lexington attacked Japanese invasion troops at Port Moresby and sank a handful of Japanese ships on their initial run in. The Japanese sought payback and over the next 2 days sent their Port Moresby-based ships and planes looking for their attackers. Both Japan and the United States began the battle with just about the same number of planes apiece, about 122. Early on the morning of May the 7th, the Japanese carrier-based aircraft found and attacked the U.S. fleet, sinking 2 U.S. ships. All the while, American planes attacked in return, sinking a Japanese aircraft carrier and battle cruiser. And so thus began the first head-to-head aircraft carrier battle in history. Aircraft carriers had already been used to launch attacks against enemy locations, but they had not been used to directly attack other aircraft carriers. Next slide. On May the 8th, Japan struck again, sinking the Lexington and crippling the Yorktown. Though heavily damaged, the USS Yorktown would be repaired in an amazing 48 hours and returned to action a year later. The U.S. was not intimidated and returned the volley, sinking the Japanese carrier Shoho and severely damaging the Shokaku. Many planes on both sides were also destroyed. That evening, both sides continued to fight by using their planes to attack the other side's fleet. Seeing the power of the American aircraft carriers, Japan realized that it would be wise to back off. They withdrew from their attempts at conquering the Coral Sea region and trying to shut out Australia as the battle ended. And what makes This battle, particularly noteworthy, this Battle of the Coral Sea, is that the opposing carriers never came to within shooting distance of one another. It was completely done by their aircraft. Next slide. And up until this point in history, naval warfare was waged by opposing ships battling it out on the sea. In ancient times, ships called triremes would, powered by men that were slaves that would row oars, would row to a position where they could then ram the side of an enemy vessel with these brass-tipped prows at the front of the ship. During the First Punic War between the Romans and the Carthaginians in 264 BC, the Romans were the first to employ a boarding device known as a corvu, which allowed Roman infantry to literally cross over onto an enemy vessel and fight like they were on land. Next slide. As early as 1250 AD, ships began using cannons to destroy one another. But again, they had to be within fairly close proximity to do so. During the 15th, the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries, ships engaged one another primarily by shooting several cannon rounds at a time into the broadside of an enemy ship. Next slide. With the advent of the aircraft carrier, planes could now take off from the flight deck and carry the fight to the enemy. Had it not been for the outcome of the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese would have had 6 carriers instead of 4 during the Battle of Midway, and things may have turned out differently for the Japanese. Next slide. An important sidebar to this Battle of the Coral Sea, was that the Japanese erroneously believed that they had sunk both American aircraft carriers, when in fact they only sank the USS Lexington. By the way, that was the first U.S. carrier sunk in the war. The Yorktown limped its way back to Pearl Harbor and was repaired and ready for duty in a record-breaking 48 hours. Coral Sea handed Japan her first defeat. And the website, I don't know if you can see it at the bottom of this slide that you're looking at, it's an interactive slide that details the events of the battle if you're interested. Next slide. This is a picture of the Lexington as it looks now, as it rests on the ocean floor, and was recently discovered by an entrepreneur that in his spare time goes looking for sunken ships. Next slide. So the Japanese thought America was out of carriers and now tried to conquer the Aleutian Islands and Midway Island, which was located about 1,000 miles off the western tip of the Hawaiian Islands. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto reasoned that if the Japanese could take Midway Island, then they could use that island as a base, a staging point for strategic bombing attacks against the west coast of the United States. Japan spared no expense and sent nearly their entire imperial fleet into the plan to take Midway. Next slide. In what historian John Keegan called, quote, the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare, end quote, U.S. codebreakers discovered the Japanese plan to attack Midway Island, and that allowed Admiral Nimitz to surprise the Japanese carrier task force on June the 4th, 1942, and annihilate them. The Battle of Midway is what many historians would consider the turning point battle of World War II. I would argue perhaps that it was the Battle of Stalingrad, but certainly Midway was a turning point because it instantly shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. In the morning of that battle, the Japanese were winning the war. When the battle was over, the Americans were winning the Pacific War. And so, you know, Admiral Yamamoto's precious, vaunted, indestructible Japanese Navy was hurt big time because they lost 4 aircraft carriers. And over the next 3 years, U.S. Marines would jump from island to island across the Central Pacific and basically root out and kill Japanese dug-in infantry. They would retake airfields that the Japanese had been using. American submarines would destroy Japanese merchant ships carrying vital oil that was needed for the Japanese war effort. And of course, at the end of the war, President Harry Truman would authorize the use of the world's first atomic bomb, which finally ends World War II. In the 1970 movie, Tora, 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 I remember watching this movie when I was young. It was, of course, about the attack on Pearl Harbor. There's a line at the end of the movie spoken by the actor that's portraying Admiral Yamamoto. And I don't know if this phrase that I'm about to quote was really stated in reality, but in the movie it was, and it of course made for a great dramatic ending to the movie. But this is what the character said in the movie. As Japanese leaders are, patting Yamamoto on the back and congratulating him for the victory at Pearl Harbor, he solemnly looks at them and replies, "I fear all we have done here today is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." And you know what? That turned out to be true, whether that was stated in real time or not. America would soon show the world that she was now wide awake. Next slide. The significance of the Battle of Midway involved the following. Rather than being surprised again, the U.S. reversed the element and surprised the Japanese. The U.S. achieved air superiority during that battle, which was crucial. I already mentioned it was a major turning point of the war. It shifted the balance of power in the PTO. The Japanese suffered a huge setback, and it marked the end of any advantage that they held in the war. Also, a U.S. carrier was commissioned in memory of the Battle of the Midway. In 1945, the USS Midway was launched, and my brother, Mike, served on that carrier for about 7 years when he was in the Navy. Next slide. For the United States, about the only experience with the Japanese up to 1942 had involved the attack on Pearl Harbor and the attack on Wake Island. Both of these attacks involved carrier-based planes. U.S. infantry, particularly U.S. Marines, had never actually engaged in close combat with the Japanese prior to August of 1942. And with the landing on Guadalcanal, all that would change, and the United States would realize what a fearless and motivated adversary they faced. When you compare the two, the average U.S. Marine in World War II was young, tough, highly trained. After about 8 weeks of Marine boot camp, he was issued either a semi-automatic M1 Garand rifle or, more commonly, the bolt-action M1903 Springfield, which was used during the Great War. Both rifles fired the highly powerful .30-06 caliber. Next slide. Unlike their U.S. Army counterparts, the Marines were issued with a different combat uniform than the Army. Rather than wearing a wool uniform, U.S. Uniform suppliers constructed the Marine Utility uniform, often called dungarees, made from a herringbone twill cotton fabric. And being cotton, the Marine uniform was cooler in the tropical climates of the Central and South Pacific. Also, setting them apart from the Army, the Marines wore camouflage helmet covers, which were reversible depending on what type of terrain they were in. This helped them to, of course, blend in with the jungle foliage. Additionally, most Marines in the Pacific carried 2 canteens on their cartridge belts as opposed to 1 because of the intense humidity. Next slide. The average Japanese soldier was also young, tough, and highly trained, highly motivated. Unlike the average Marine who grew up in relative ease in the United States, the Japanese soldier was used to living in squalid conditions, subsisting on just a tiny simple diet of rice and maybe fish. That's all he required, and he was able to endure the humidity in the hot jungles. One thing that U.S. troops quickly discovered upon engaging in combat with the Japanese was that the average Japanese soldier would never consider surrendering. Now, in Europe, in the European theater, the ETO, this was not the case, because German troops would often surrender in droves when they encountered American troops, but not so with the Japanese. Even if the Japanese were completely outgunned, overwhelmed in numbers, they still wouldn't consider surrender. And that was because of that warrior code I mentioned called Bushido. Next slide. Admiral Chester Nimitz, I mentioned him a little bit ago, was in charge of the Southwest Pacific area, which included Australia, the East Indies, and part of the Philippines. General MacArthur sort of ran the rest of it. And so the decision to sort of divide up control in the Pacific theater between these two men, Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, it ended up creating somewhat of a bitter rivalry between these two men because they both had enormous egos and they were both quite prideful. Next slide. The Allies' first big test and how they would work together in the Pacific ended up being a 7-month battle on an island in the Solomon Islands chain known as Guadalcanal. Next slide. When Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, saw how badly the U.S. had beat the Japanese at Midway, he insisted that the American victory be exploited before the Japanese recovered their offensive momentum. And part of that exploitation involved U.S. aerial reconnaissance that revealed that the Japanese had been building an airfield on the island of Guadalcanal, which gave this island its military value as a target. Next slide. Guadalcanal is a 90-mile long by 25-mile wide patch of dense scrub and jungle. Guadalcanal would serve as a perfect airfield to launch future bombing raids on Japan. Additionally, if the Allies could take and hold Guadalcanal, they could protect Australia from Japanese attack. So, Allied planners quickly realized they had to prevent the Japanese from completing that airfield, or more importantly, using that airfield. Next slide. In late June 1942, Admiral Robert Gormley, commander of the South Pacific area, handed Marine General A.A. Vandergrift a sealed dispatch stating that the 1st U.S. Marine Division would attack the Japanese on Guadalcanal, and this became known as Operation Watchtower. Operation Watchtower. On July the 28th, 1942, by the way, the same day that Hitler launched Fall Blau, Case Blue, Vandergrift's Marines arrived in Fiji, and the date for the attack was pushed back to August 7 to give them time to rehearse the amphibious landings. Next slide. On the morning of August the 7th, 1942, U.S. Marines from the 1st Marine Division clambered down their cargo nets from the sides of their transport ships and embarked themselves into Higgins boats, landing craft, and headed towards the beach. And when they hit the beach, they were shocked because there were no Japanese soldiers there, at least on the beach. And they were dumbfounded. They fully expected to, just like what happened on D-Day, they expected to, come out of the Higgins boats and face intense enemy small arms fire, but that didn't happen. By nightfall, 11,000 Marines were ashore, setting up camping areas all along the stretch of beach. And although they did encounter sporadic resistance, mainly at night, all seemed to be going very well. Of course, that was going to change. Next slide. The key to controlling Guadalcanal and its precious airfield, which was soon renamed Henderson Field in honor of Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed during the Battle of Midway. The control was to control the water around the island, and a Japanese surface squadron of 7 cruisers and a destroyer attacked an Australian screening force near Savo Island on August the 9th and ended up destroying 3 American cruisers, the USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes, and the USS Astoria, as well as destroying and sinking an Australian carrier. And so, in what became known as the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese handed the U.S. Navy her most humiliating defeat ever suffered in a fair fight. The Battle of Savo Island was just the first in a series of naval battles that were going on around Guadalcanal that would last all the way until November. As the weeks wore on with Marines struggling in unbearable conditions on Guadalcanal, the Japanese and Allied armies navies continued to battle it out in the waters around the island. And for the next 4 months, the waters around Guadalcanal would be the unlikely scene of the most bitter, protracted naval struggle in the Pacific War. And although neither party realized it at the time, the Japanese had found the decisive battle that their naval doctrine called for. Unfortunately, it wasn't just a battle, it was a campaign they could not hope to win, as the material superiority of their adversary and the willingness of the Americans to accept stunning naval losses to hold on to that island gradually eroded the vital cruiser and destroyer strength of the Japanese fleet. Next slide. So here's some of the battles that I was referring to that happened during Operation Watchtower. Battle of Savo Island, the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, or Iron Bottom Sound, and the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and then the Battle of Tassafaronga. And by September, the Japanese had about 6,000 troops on the island of Guadalcanal. On the 12th, they attacked U.S. Marine and Army troops of the 164th Infantry Regiment in an attempt to clear the high ground south of Henderson Field. And this became known as the famous Battle of Bloody Ridge, with a casualty ratio of 10 Japanese for every 1 American. Next slide. By December, the exhausted men of the 1st Marine Division were finally relieved, and the campaign ground to a halt in February, with Japanese troops evacuating the island. Next slide. The Guadalcanal campaign, which started in August of 42 and ended in February 43, was significant for a few reasons. Number one, the world would learn of some legendary Marines, such as Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, and then Sergeant John Basilone, who received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroism on Guadalcanal. He held off 3,000 Japanese troops single-handedly after his 15-member unit was reduced to only 2 other men. He was later killed, unfortunately, in action on Iwo Jima in February of 1945. And Basilone was he was one of the first U.S. Marines to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. Number 2, Guadalcanal was the beginning of a long and costly retreat as the Japanese and Navy forces battled it out, and the Marines defeated them island by island. Number 3, Guadalcanal was the first time in the war that the United States President got involved in the allocation of military forces to a specific theater of operations. And then number 4, Guadalcanal was the first real combat test for the United States forces in World War II. Operation Torch would not happen for another couple months. Next slide. Here's a picture of Chesty Puller and John Basilone. And in March of 1943, just a month after Guadalcanal ended, Allied planners approved a second approach towards the Philippines, and Admiral Nimitz chose the Gilbert Islands as his launch pad. Next slide. The Gilbert Islands, a group of 16 atolls near the equator in the Central Pacific, was viewed by the United States as a stepping stone to the Marshall Islands and became the first target of the Central Pacific Campaign. In November of 1943, the United States launched an offensive codenamed Operation Galvanic, in which the prime target was the tiny islet, if you'll look at the next picture there, of Betio, B-E-T-I-O, Betio, in the Tarawa Atoll of the Gilbert Islands. While U.S. Marines stormed ashore on Tarawa, or Betio, U.S. Army troops from the 27th and 69th Infantry Divisions landed at Macon Atoll to destroy the Japanese Air Corps that was stationed there. By the way, an atoll, A-T-O-L-L, if you're not familiar with that geographical feature, is a ring-shaped coral reef, including a coral rim that encircles a lagoon. So, roughly 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii, the Tarawa Atoll consisted of a series of little coral islets that stretched through the ocean in sort of like a fishhook fashion. And the military importance of this atoll lay in its strategic location as the gateway for the U.S. drive through the Central Pacific towards the Philippines. Next slide. Of course, the largest of Tarawa's islets is Betio, measuring less than 3 miles in length and only a half mile at its widest point. And so here on Betio, the Japanese had built an airstrip and defended it with 4,700 troops, dug into this network of pillboxes and bunkers interconnected by underground tunnels and defended by wire and mines. So the task of dislodging this force fell to the Marines' 2nd Division. The resulting struggle produced one of the fiercest and bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. An interesting thing about Betio was that it was ringed by this jagged, razor-sharp coral reefs, and that made it tough for Marine landing craft to land the troops as it needed to, because the razor-sharp coral reef would tear the bottoms out of these landing craft. Not only that, when Marines, when they jumped over the sides of these landing craft, they discovered that getting ashore was going to be every bit as difficult as U.S. Army troops faced on D-Day. Next slide. On November the 13th, 1943, U.S. Navy battleships delivered a stunning pre-bombardment attack on the Tarawa Atoll, but it did little damage. And that's because the Japanese had dug these deep caves and bunkers, which were pretty much impervious to the fire of naval guns. On November the 20th, the Marines went ashore. Next slide. Unlike the uncontested landing at Guadalcanal, nothing seemed to go right for the Marines on Tarawa. The Higgins boats and the Amtracs fighting vehicles bottomed out on the jagged coral, which is exactly what the Japanese had expected. So therefore, they trained their guns right on those coral reefs. Under intense fire, Marines would scamper over the sides of their landing craft into this chest-deep water and have to slog several hundred yards towards the beach through jagged, razor-sharp coral while being shot at by the Japanese. Can't imagine that. By that evening, 1,500 Marines were dead or wounded. The next morning, reinforcements made the same perilous journey, bringing with them tanks and artillery, and by the end of the day, the Marines were able to break out from the beach to the inland, and the fierce combat continued on that atoll for another 2 days. The cost of victory was very high for the Marines, who suffered nearly 3,000 casualties in a mere 76 hours. The toll was even higher for the Japanese. Because of the 4,700 defenders, only 17 Japanese survived. Their willingness to fight to the last man, that Bushido Code, basically foreshadowed the fierceness of what the Marines were in store for as they went from island to island to island. Next slide. As in all military engagements, there were some lessons learned from Tarawa, and the Americans learned some things about the techniques involved in future amphibious landings. Number one, they learned that they needed better pre-invasion reconnaissance. They had no idea the depth of defensive fortifications the Japanese had constructed. Number two, they needed better and different types of naval fire support. Number three, they needed better ship-to-shore communications so they could better evacuate the wounded and to get more supplies where they needed to be. As a side note, one of the Americans who went ashore with the Marines that November 20th was a war correspondent by the name of Bob Sherrod. Risking his life, Sherrod captured some of the first color footage of the U.S. Marines engaged in combat with the Japanese, and he turned this footage into a documentary film entitled With the Marines at Tarawa, which went on to win an Academy Award in 1945. And as American civilians would attend movie theaters back home, they saw this footage during the previews and learned firsthand of the incredible horror of war. Next slide. As the march to Tokyo continued, General MacArthur used the high U.S. casualty figures to try and persuade the Joint Chiefs in Washington to block the U.S. Navy's island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific and the Gilbert Islands, and instead shift focus and resource to liberating the Philippines. And when this was rejected, the Marshall Islands became the next target for U.S. forces. Next slide. The Marshall Islands were part of the numerous islands formerly belonging to Imperial Germany, which Japan received after the Treaty of Versailles. And soon after the Great War ended, they started to build military bases there. Throughout December 43 and January of 44, land-based aircraft operating from the freshly captured airfield on Tarawa took recon photographs of the Marshall Islands. Next slide. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance was given overall command of what became known as Operation Flintlock. Operation Flintlock. And so, the U.S. Army 7th Infantry, 4th Marine Division, along with a Navy task force, were tasked with capturing Roy, Namur, and Kwajalein atolls. As a Valentine's Day Newsweek magazine said in the Battle of Kwajalein, that, quote, the U.S. Navy won the most brilliant victory of the Pacific War. 8 days later, the Marines and the Navy took Eniwetok, and the American media began to see that the drive across the Central Pacific started to make sense. Next slide. On March the 12th, 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the occupation of the Marianas Islands, specifically targeting the three islands of Tinian, Guam, and Saipan. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in that order. And this was, of course, codenamed Operation Forager. Next slide. Capturing the Marianas would result in the following benefits for the United States. Number one, it would enable the United States to develop an advanced naval base for submarine and surface operations. And number two, it would establish an air base for the new B-29 Super Fortress aircraft bomber to conduct non-stop bombing raids on Japan. And although the Marianas proved to be the most valuable real estate captured by the Americans in the Pacific War, the decision to occupy them was a political nightmare. Again, General MacArthur objected because he wanted all Pacific resources pooled in the Southwest Pacific, specifically to the Philippines. It took the Army Chief of Staff, General Marshall, stepping in to settle the squabble between Admiral King, the Chief of the Navy, and MacArthur. On June the 15th, 1944, 8,000 Marines landed on the west coast of Saipan and endured 3.5 weeks of hard, brutal fighting. On the morning of June the 19th, the naval portion of the fight for the Marianas developed, known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese aircraft carrier Ozawa launched its planes in the hopes of destroying the assembled U.S. fleet in the Philippine Sea. The planes came in 4 separate raids, all of which were intercepted by U.S. planes before they could cause any kind of serious damage. So many Japanese planes were shot down that American airmen labeled it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. By July the 9th, 1944, Saipan was in U.S. hands. Tinian Island was taken on August the 1st, and Guam 9 days after that. Next slide. In the days following the Marianas campaign, the Navy Seabees began to build an air base there to be used by the new B-29 Superfortress, the very planes that would drop the first and second atomic bomb on Japan. As the Marianas campaign wound up, MacArthur pressed his argument that the United States owed the Filipino people their freedom, having abandoned them in 1942. And rather than approve a landing on Luzon, as MacArthur wanted, the Joint Chiefs approved a plan to land on Mindanao in November of 1944. Next slide. Japanese planners harbored little doubt that the Americans would next attack the Philippines. And in anticipation for the coming attack, Japanese Admiral Toyoda ordered Admiral Takeo to create a central task force consisting of those super battleships I mentioned a little while ago, the Musashi and the Yamato, 3 older battleships, 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and they were to sail through the San Bernardino Strait into an area called Leyte Gulf, where they were to intercept U.S. carriers heading for Mindanao. Next slide. As the greatest naval battle in military history, and it was, rapidly took shape, Nimitz was tasked in September of 1944 with capturing several key air bases on islands in the Palau Island group in order to secure the flank for U.S. forces preparing to attack the Japanese on the Philippines. And so, Marines landed on the island of Peleliu in September of 1944. The Battle of Peleliu was fought from September the 15th to November the 27th. Next slide. The defense of the island of Peleliu was overseen by Japanese Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, and following a string of defeats, the Japanese began to sort of reassess their approach to island defense. And rather than attempting to halt the Allies, the Marines, as they landed on the beach, they devised a new strategy which called for the islands to be heavily fortified with strong points and bunkers, and these defense networks were connected by caves and tunnels which allowed troops to be shifted from one area to another without being under the threat of Marine fire. Peleliu turned out to be one of the costliest battles for U.S. Marines in history because they literally had to root out every single Japanese soldier that was, hunkered down in a cave or a bunker. On November the 24th, with American forces closing in, Colonel Nakagawa committed suicide. 3 days later, on November the 27th, the island of Peleliu was finally secure. And post-war analysts calculated that it took U.S. forces over 1,500 rounds to kill each Japanese soldier. Next slide, and we're almost done here. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was one of the largest and most complex naval battles in history, and it ended in a massive American victory that effectively destroyed the fighting capability of the Japanese Navy. In one sense, 4 battles actually comprised the Battle of Leyte Gulf: the Battle of the Suriago Strait, the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Cape Engano, and the Battle of Samar. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, as I said, was a massive Japanese defeat. Japanese Navy lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, 9 destroyers, a total of 300,000 tons of ships, The Americans only lost 37,000 tons of shipping, including a light carrier and 2 escort carriers. And over the next 3 months, a desperate fight to liberate the Philippines continued, with General MacArthur leading the way. With their navy turned inside out, with their navy ruined, their island bases in the Central and Southern Pacific in U.S. hands, the only thing now lying between the Americans and mainland Japan were 2 more obstacles: the island of Iwo Jima, which literally means Sulphur Island, and the island of Okinawa. And so we will stop there and pick it up next week.